What is its nature? What does he do, this man you see? What needs does he serve by killing?
Anger. Social acceptance and sexual frustrations.
No, he covets.
Welcome and Happy New Year to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. And here's wishing you an authentic New Year. One way to achieve that is please try and use your real name and even your real photo on when you comment on these forums, and let's also encourage creators to do the same thing. Now, on Saturday, that is the Saturday after his arrest, the public defender of Monroe County, Pennsylvania, where Kohberger is being held, says that Kohberger intends to waive his extradition hearing to face charges in Idaho. He should be presumed innocent until proven otherwise, not tried in the court of public opinion. That's according to his public defender, Jason LeBar. He said that in a statement, adding, Mr. Kohberger is eager to be exonerated of these charges and looks forward to resolving these matters as promptly as possible. Kohberger's lawyer has also described his new client as highly intelligent. Committing crimes, especially murder, is hardly the soul of wit, though. One thing LeBar is right about is that Kohberger should not be tried in the court of public opinion. And so in that respect, we should be referring to him as the suspect. And that's the reason Moscow PD have made such an effort to keep the details secret in order not to contaminate a jury, as Kaylee's father mentioned a few days ago.
And I'm just wondering, had you heard the name Brian Kohberger before today?
No, we had not. That's just completely honest. Everything was kept under the wraps. The investigation did everything they could to keep this away from the public, to keep the jury untainted, do everything by the book, and I believe they've done an amazing job of that.
Tainting a jury, contaminating a jury, well, that favors a defendant in this case, or in any case. And so that is not what law enforcement wants to do. It's not what we want to do. It's not what social media, in terms of their attempt to prosecute this case, should do. And so we don't want to do this merely because the killer was born in November, start calling him a serial killer. Or this.
No eyewitness. Here we now have a graduate student in criminology, a PhD student in criminology, who bears so much resemblance to Ted Bundy. It's scary. They were both students at a high level. Bundy was a law student. Kohberger was a criminal justice PhD. They both moved away from their initial universities, I believe, to get away from their earlier crimes, and as did Kohberger and Bundy both. So it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out over the next couple of days and see if they're, I hate to say it, but other victims.
I also hate that he had to say that. That was from the former assistant FBI director Chris Swecker on Fox News about 17 hours ago, already comparing Kohberger to Ted Bundy and saying outright he finds it hard to believe that this was his first kill. In other words, he's already suggesting, without evidence on like day 2, that Kohberger could be a serial killer. What we want to do, and what we do on this channel, is we build our case as if we were prosecutors. We do that by collating the facts, gathering information, and constructing a picture of who we are dealing with, why they are, how they are, and how that fits into the fabric, the facts, the evidence, the dynamics of this case, or how they don't fit. That takes time. It takes time to gather that information and then also to absorb and filter and synthesize that information into something cogent. That's what we're trying to do on this channel, and we're starting to do on this episode, starting to build a picture, build a portrait, paint a portrait of who this person is. The symbol for this channel has been this image, which represents not only our attempt to build an idea of who someone else is, what their psychology and how their dynamics are relevant to a certain set of circumstances, but simultaneously construct a system for ourselves to decipher our reality, to decipher ourselves, to decipher ourselves and our society and our world beyond true crime. The trick to finding our way to the golden thread in this case and in all cases is first of all focusing on what we know to build our case, but secondly to see through all the noise and fluff and post-it, in terms of post-it nonsense, which amounts to a kind of shitstorm, a kind of a maelstrom of accidental or deliberate misdirection by everybody else. And it's up to you guys to decide how well do we execute on that mission? How well do we see through all of the murk? In this analysis, which you will see is part of a step-by-step process, part of a system that was developed through writing many, many books, we'll also deal with an important clue to the next step in the analysis. And that is, how is the who of this guy connected to the who of Kaylee? How do those dynamics come into play? So by the end of this episode, if you've been paying attention, you should be able to answer that question. What is the next step in this analysis? Before we get to the rest of this episode, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Many thanks and a big welcome and a Happy New Year to the thousands of you who have subscribed. If you're enjoying this episode, please like, share, leave a comment, and let's get started. So the previous step in our analysis involved looking at the face of the suspect. And the idea isn't that that's the beginning and end of your analysis. Looking at someone's appearance, it's a starting point. It's a very important starting point. We do judge a book by its cover because that's what somebody else did as well. And we try and not judge it, but we try and just get a sense of how did the world see this guy? How did this guy see himself? How did he appear within society? And what did that mean? That's a really important conversation. Then we examine the dynamics, which we're going to do here. Before we do, what I want you to do is take out your True Crime Rocket Science notebooks or any notebook and do a scorecard on not only this analysis within the context of the information we'll be looking at here, but also the analysis that preceded this analysis on this channel. When we didn't know, when no one knew who the suspect was, on your scorecard, you want to write down some of the traits we came up with and then measure their relevance or importance in a score out of 5. 5 means spot on, 1 means a total miss. So on the scorecard, you want 7 points. Number 1, emasculated. 2, entitled. 3, incel. 4, physically fit. 5, peeping Tom. 6, he has hunted before. 7, he hasn't killed before. And then you would put a score out of 35. Do that now, and once you've listened to this episode, review your score. You can go through all of those again and provide a updated score if necessary, based on your updated fine-tuned knowledge. Wow, and that brings us to the TCRS assessment of Kohberger, based on collating a lot of information. Where does it take us? How do we take that information and do something with it? Well, this is how.
What is the first and principal thing he does? What needs does he serve by killing?
Can you answer that? Can you answer what need does he serve by killing? If you can answer that, that means you really know who this guy is pretty well. If you can't answer it or you're unsure, well, that means we need to be curious. We need to try and figure out who he is. But let's listen to Clarice's answer. What need does he serve by killing? What does she say?
Anger. Social acceptance and sexual frustration.
Do you agree with that? Do you think she's right?
No, he covets.
Can that be right? Can it be that he is not angry? I mean, didn't this look like and feel like a rage killing? Doesn't it seem like this guy is struggling with social acceptance? Doesn't it seem like he's struggling with sexual frustration? So is Hannibal really right here when he says he covets?
He covets. That is his nature. And how do we begin to covet? Now, we begin by coveting what we see every day.
He's right. Someone coveting what they see every day is someone who is on the outside looking in. Imagine that in a student context, a student who covets what he sees every day, and where a student is a highly charged environment. We'll come back to that in a moment. But think about it, Ted Bundy did that as well, also coveted, and Ted Bundy was also studying law, which is this idea of restricting oneself, applying rules to society, being bound by certain rules, applying those rules, holding people accountable, while giving up on them yourself. That's a useful and important analogy, but that is, I think, where the allegory ends. Now, in a very basic way, our killer is simply a lonely, lost, and yes, frustrated boy. And that loneliness, frustration, that sense of being lost and not belonging anywhere or to anyone, just to his own rigidities, becomes a source of insufficiency, anxiety, and ultimately teeth-grinding frustration. Let's ask a simple question. Does Brian Kohberger have a girlfriend? Does Brian Kohberger have a best friend? Who is the person closest to Kohberger? Well, there already is a big part of your answer. He's on the outside looking in. He covets because he doesn't have friends, because he doesn't belong. Somehow he, as a man, as a creature growing in physical potency, think about a man going through his 20s, is becoming more and more potent, is becoming physically stronger. And yet somehow he finds himself diminishing in social potency, which leads to him slipping in terms of sexual potency, all of which begins to impinge on his identity. His overall agency, he realizes, is dropping as well. What is agency in the simplest terms? Well, it's wanting to be Tyler Durden instead of the virtually nameless, faceless weakling, which is Jack. In Fight Club, the contrast between the self-help, group therapy clinging nobody and the fighting demigod embodied by a ripped Brad Pitt couldn't be more pronounced, and that's the point. Self-agency is power and control. And you got a sense of that from Kaylee and Maddie and really all the kids inside that house, right? But having no self-agency means you're powerless and picked on. The question is Kohberger a dead ringer for the Jack in Fight Club or not? When he loses agency, he feels like he's losing control. And as he falls down the rabbit hole, clearly he is. And so how does a lost boy wrest control back? Well, he may try to negotiate his way, then coerce his way, and finally, when the chips are down, force his way back. Is that what our suspect did? Well, let's take a look. How does a lost boy wrest control back? And this may or may not be different to the way a girl does it. Number one, negotiation. What do we know about Kohberger? We know he spent his entire life as a student thus far. It appears he has endeavored to get a sense of control of the world through negotiation, in the academic sense. I'll try to understand you, and maybe that will help you understand me. Well, has it succeeded? If you're wrestling inside a construct where you have no agency, the temptation is to cheat the system, to lie, to manipulate, to regain control, not through hard work, but some sort of foul play. We do know that the questions in terms of Kohberger's survey of criminal offenders seem to focus on crowdsourcing the ways to plan for and get away with a crime. And yet the kind of questions that he asks do hint at an unsophisticated offender, someone who's not confident in his own abilities. And that brings us to manipulation. According to the Daily Mail, quote, he would go after my intelligence. He would basically insinuate that I'm kind of slow-witted and that I'm forgetful and that I lack the intelligence to be his friend. That is what a friend of his said about Kohberger. In other words, he was very manipulative. Also from the Daily Mail, but a different article, quote, reading his staffer's note on Kohberger, Cyril Neck of Central Valley, Pennsylvania, said, hey, this guy makes creepy comments. Keep an eye on him. He'll have 2 or 3 beers and then just get a little too comfortable, end quote. So you do get a sense that him making creepy comments is an attempt, but a failing attempt, at manipulation and also control. It's also interesting that he may be averse to eating meat, but he isn't averse to alcohol. And when he does drink alcohol, what happens? Next aspect, control. Thomas Arendts, and I think his sister Casey, I'm not sure if it's a boy or a girl, but Casey Arendts, I think, also put up a photo of Kohberger. So it seems like the Arendts kids knew him. And anyway, Thomas said that he would happily note the flaws and insecurities of his friends in order to distract from his own weight struggles. So there you kind of get a sense of him using manipulation as an attempt to regain control, pointing out the flaws and insecurities in others in order to distract them from, at that time, his own weight struggles. The brewery owner also said that Kohberger would ask women in the bar who they were with, and where they lived. That is also kind of in a sense, manipulative and controlling by trying to get hold of, sensitive private information. And then there's also coercion. Apparently he was a heavy-set kid, and then he was a bully, and then he turned himself into an extreme vegan and a very dominant personality. That's based on what people who knew him said. So he was a fat kid, then he was a bully, then he turned himself into an extreme vegan and a thin person. Seems like sport and exercise was part of that. And then he became a very dominant personality. Does a dominant personality mean that he was an extrovert? Anyway, when they ignored him, the girls in the restaurant, he would get upset with them a little bit, Cyril Neck told NBC. So what is happening there is, despite his coercion, despite his manipulation, despite his attempts at control, despite his negotiation, he fails. And what happens when that happens? He gets upset. But what is all of this kind of revolving around? Coveting. He goes into a bar, sees the waitresses, and finds himself attracted to them. He covets them, and he finds he can't establish any kind of connection with them. The next aspect is denial or living a lie. The bar owner said that the last he spoke with Kohberger, he confronted the man, he confronted him about his alleged inappropriate behavior. If this happened on the drive back to Pennsylvania, that he was again flirting with people and they were turning him down, it just shows to what extent it was ever present in his mind, in his body, in his heart. And the struggle was very real. Anyway, so the bar owner went up to him and actually said, kind of intervened, said, "Hey, Brian, welcome back. I just want to talk to you real quick and make sure you're going to be respectful this time, and we're not going to have any issues." This time makes it sound like had it happened before. And apparently Brian was startled at this. You kind of get the idea that he thought he was going under the radar. He didn't realize that someone was taking notes and reporting him. You can imagine if he is the killer. I mean, at this point he's a suspect, but if he is the killer, something like this would be quite startling. Wow, someone is actually monitoring me. Someone is actually aware that I'm not behaving right. Someone has actually told someone in authority this. And so the bar owner said he was shocked that I was saying that, and he said, "I don't know what you're talking about. You totally have me confused." That denial is also a kind of coercion, a kind of manipulation, a kind of attempt at control. It wasn't just that. He, at this restaurant, apparently called one of the waitresses a bitch, and that gives you an idea that he's not just upset, he's actually kind of angry, and is actually getting kind of aggressive in an unacceptable way. Well, isn't that par for the course for someone in the situation? He's not just coveting, he's getting down, he's getting desperate. And so if you add all of those aspects together, it starts with a lost boy trying to get control. He tries negotiation, he tries manipulation, he tries control, he tries coercion. He's in denial when you confront him about it. He's living a lie. He's in this sort of fantasy world of what he thinks he is owed to him. And at the end of all of that, how does he try to get what he thinks he deserves? Well, through force. you have a gradual increase in violent behavior and dominance over people. But how does that start? Well, with violent thoughts, with a particular kind of thinking that becomes more and more extreme, and then eventually kind of violent. It becomes fantasy. So this idea that someone couldn't just out of nowhere commit a crime like that, that could be true, but if it's within a fantasy scenario, then it's not like that. I mean, Jeffrey Dahmer had to start somewhere as well. So we know that the Idaho quadruple murder suspect harassed female staff at a Pennsylvania bar near his hometown. And we know that he's had problematic interactions with women in a bar. That's according to the 34-year-old bar owner. That's of the Seven Siren Brewing Company bar, right? And so when you're trying to force the issue, what is one of the alternatives to that? If you can't get what you want through all of those other things, manipulation, coercion, what is one of the ways you could force the issue? Well, murder. You try and you try and you fail endlessly. You're a creep, you're impotent, you're not wanted, you don't have any agency, and yet you covet. You covet, you covet, you covet.
What is its nature? What does he do, this man you seek? He covets. That is his nature.
Now, a very interesting question is, did he develop this nature through nurture, or was he born with this nature, or is it a combination? We'll leave that for another episode. But what happens when you covet and you see, you want, but you can't have? What if you could? Think about that thought. I can't have this, but what if I could? The fact that the criminal here committed a violent and a violent only crime, right? There wasn't a sexual aspect to it. I think is an acknowledgement of his own lack of sexual agency. The crime is the killer's most authentic moment when he admits defeat, but at the same time, he tries to force the world to give him the potency he feels is his fair share, potency he deserves. Can you see, although anger is a component, sexual frustration is a component, lack of social acceptance is a component, all of these are part of an individual who ultimately finds himself on the outside of society looking in. He's kind of like, in general, a peeping Tom in terms of society. He can't get inside. He's not allowed inside. Maybe he can see inside, but he's on the outside. And so he commits this crime, not so much out of anger, but out of fear, out of the social death abyss he has fallen into. He doesn't want to fall any further. He wants to get out of it. This is his way back, a way of regaining a sense of salvation within what he sees and feels as a living death. It's within his symbolic framework that he sees this as a way out. Also, this killer isn't someone who lacks feeling or lacks empathy or lacks emotions. If anything, he is overwhelmed by them. But at some point, the sheer tidal wave of his own feelings begins to distort and interfere with his interest in paying attention to the hearts and minds and feelings of others. Because he has been at the mercy of their fickle feelings, he wants them to be at the mercy of his. He wants them to feel his pain, and it is sharp, it is searing, it is a penetrating chest wound. And that is why he is chatty in class after it's done. He feels reborn, he feels relieved. He feels like he's crawled out of the sewer, at least within his own mythos. Can you see that the murders are done for symbolic reasons? Because he has been caught up in a fantasy world, a world of esteem, right? And a world of esteem where he was losing his. Can you see that? And that brings up the question, how do you lose control? How do you lose esteem to begin with? What is the journey that Kohberger has been on? What has been the meat and potatoes? What has been the reality of this pride-swallowing siege that he's been on? Well, losing agency means losing control. Regaining agency means regaining control. But do you gain agency by trying to control others, by becoming controlling, or by gaining control or discipline or mastery over yourself? I suppose it's relative. I suppose you could say, you know what, I'm becoming more controlling and it feels good. And it may not be real control, but it's the best I can do. Maybe I'm struggling to have self-discipline, control myself. So if I can't control myself, I'll control somebody else. One way to understand how we gain agency is also how we lose it. One arena for gaining or indeed losing agency is the highly charged social arena that is the classroom. We mentioned it earlier. Clearly, 10 years after leaving school, Kohberger was still in the classroom and still not achieving the sort of agency he felt he deserved. The first thing to say is that you lose control when you lose esteem. And you lose esteem whenever you lose control, just as Kohberger seemed to do at the Seven Siren Brewing Company. And let's face it, what makes us different to the animals are that we are creatures primarily that are nourished by esteem. Now, according to Gilliam, a former FBI agent, she said, I have a feeling that there was something wrong when he was young. Not sure if it's a he or a she, but Gilliam said, I've got a feeling there was something wrong when he was young. Now, one way to lack agency is to be born into a state of insufficiency and or insignificance. Kohberger's father is a maintenance worker and his mother a substitute teacher. They are, according to a friend, genuinely kind people, but I would imagine also somewhat simple people. Apparently, Kohberger's father even went down to accompany his son on the drive back. That would seem like a very kind gesture, but if you compare that to Kaylee or Maddie or even Ethan, can you imagine their parents going to Moscow and driving them home or kind of being passengers in the vehicle on the way home? So there is a sense of financial struggle in his story, social isolation in his story, but also social simplicity in terms of an expressly rural fabric. I recently saw a graph that shows how America's politics are basically divided into urban voters who vote a particular way and rural voters who vote another way. And there's a movie on Netflix that I think kind of illustrates that. It's called Irresistible. It came out in 2020. And it simply shows that rural folk kind of have a different mindset, and one's got to be aware of that. And there are different ways of looking at that mindset. You might say the rural mindset is narrower or wider, or is it? Is it narrower or wider? Is it closed or more open than the urban mindset? And in particular, how is it different to, say, the student mindset of gratuitous living? Is the rural mindset more traditional or more modern, would you say? And that's kind of the thing you want to think about and apply to Kohberger, not to yourself, to Kohberger. The likelihood that Kohberger brushed shoulders with hunters in a rural setting or hunted or fished himself is relatively higher than if he lived elsewhere. Did his father or uncle or cousin hunt or shoot? Another way to assess agency is by looking at how the college system itself confers it. Of the 4 universities in this narrative, which is the most prestigious and which is the least? Well, by far the most prestigious is the one that played the University of Idaho on the night of the murders. University of California, Davis, number 38 in national universities, is in the top 40 of best universities according to one ranking in America. The University of Idaho isn't even in the top 100 or even the top 150. It's ranked 176. But Washington State University, the university that he attended, is ranked below 200. It's at 212. And then DeSales is at 285. So a huge jump. I mean, really what you want to compare is the University of Idaho and the kids there at 176 in national universities, which is, I guess, somewhere in the middle. And then DeSales at 285. And it's not so much what do you think of these universities, but what did the kids at these universities think of someone who might come from another university? when you went to university, what did you think of how prestigious it was, and how prestigious was yours compared to others? That was part of your reality at varsity, wasn't it? So how do you think Kohberger's fellow students felt about him coming from the ultra-obscure and sort of in-the-sticks DeSales, with barely a quarter of the student numbers as the University of Idaho? There are barely 2,300 students at DeSales. Compare that to the University of California with 31,000, and then Idaho with 8,600, and Washington State University 24,000. One must also ask, why did he change universities? Was it too expensive, or did he want to experience a change of culture? Also, his own university, WSU, has got 12 times as many students as he was used to at DeSales. So do you think he did have a sense of a bit of a culture shock? Did he feel that the society was different when he went from one university to another? Well, have you ever done that? I know I once went from quite a conservative university to advertising school, just totally different. Well, regardless, he would have experienced a serious change in culture anyway, whether he wanted to or not. Incidentally, many high-profile cases are associated with geographical transplantation, because what happens when that happens? There's also a bit of a cultural shift and the need to adapt culturally that you may underestimate. Think about the Ramseys who moved to Boulder in 1991, 5 years prior to disaster. They were also about to fly to Michigan when John Bonet was killed. Think about Meredith Kircher, who was studying in Italy. She was from Britain. And also Amanda Knox, an expat from America, living with her. Kircher was due to go back to England for her mother's birthday, days before she was killed. Amanda Knox and her boyfriend were due to go to a little town called Gubbio, also on the day that Meredith was killed. Suzanne Morphy had moved from Indiana 2 years before she disappeared. Kelsey Bereth had moved to Colorado from California, also shortly before her death. Jodi Arias had attempted to move from Wairika, California to Mesa, Arizona. When she did, what did she encounter there? Because there was a real cultural thing that she had to adapt to, and she did try. The Watts family had moved from North Carolina to Frederick, Colorado. These movements involve social dislocation and cultural contradictions, also social encounters with new people, and necessarily a confrontation with who you are versus who the locals are and where you come from relative to where they are from. You are tested in the real world, and when you are found wanting or discover you don't fit in or discover you do, that can lead to a crisis. Now, what we do know is classmates noted that Kohberger was intelligent but had few friends, and that was especially after he'd apparently made anti-LGBTQ comments. We also know that he was struggling with weight issues. Who else had weight issues? Chris Watts, Brian Laundrie. So think about the questions we've asked. Do we see manipulation, coercion, and control in Kohberger's backstory? Do we see a need for it? Has he hunted before? Well, we know he lived in a rural setting, and thus he seemed to lack the sophisticated tools required for the mindfuckery of the criminal mastermind. But in a psychological sense, it's true. He has crowdsourced criminals to find a way to commit the perfect murder. That's a sly and cynical mind, yet aware of its own shortcomings right there. In terms of hunting before, I suppose you could also include in that stalking. Was he stalking his prey before he committed the crime? And there does seem to be some evidence or certainly some talk about whether that is the case. Also, was he a peeping Tom? Online, quite likely, but how about in the area? So what we are seeing is someone who appears to be making up for his physical inadequacy through intellectual arrogance. He thinks, or rather hopes, that he is smart. He quotes Aristotle. He likes the idea of being a criminal genius who profits at society's loss, because that is exactly the inversion he needs, to profit. But this is ego profit at society's loss. And in terms of society's loss, it's in actual lives. His arrogance here is measured here by 4 lives and by the brazen manner in which he not only commits a crime, but fully expects to get away with it. Now, Elon Musk once said that I tend to approach things from a physics framework. And I mean, this channel is called True Crime Rocket Science, so we do as well. But Elon Musk said, physics teaches you to reason from first principles rather than by analogy. In true crime, we like to use both systems, first principles and analogies, or what I call intertextuality. Now it's time to review the original scores you placed on your scorecard. Let's go through them again. 1, emasculated. So you want to test whether what we said previously about Kohberger before we knew it was him, and also what we know now, whether that has turned out to be true. If so, how true is it? Number 1, emasculated. 2, entitled. 3, incel. Think about that. Have we heard from any ex-girlfriends so far? Number 4, physically fit. 5, peeping Tom. 6, he has hunted before. 7, he hasn't killed before. Now, if we get a sense of Kohberger's dynamics from the opposite sex from a bar setting, what is the next step in this analysis? How do you think he encountered Kaylee? So I'm not going to take it further than that, and I do apologize. This is quite a long episode. I have not tried to sync all the audio. That would take the entire day. And so if there were sort of dead areas where you weren't really seeing anything interesting, well, hopefully the audio made up for it. As a parting shot, if you've been listening this long, I want to repeat what I said at the beginning. I want to encourage you guys in the spirit of having an authentic year. And if you have an authentic year, that means you're going to have a good year. You're going to have a real year. You're not going to have a year that's a fairy tale that turns into a nightmare. And in the spirit of that, I want to encourage you to use your real name on YouTube. That is going to encourage you to be honest and to be disciplined in your comments. I also want to encourage creators to do the same thing, and their subscribers to encourage their creators also to be transparent about who they are. That'll make true crime a more legitimate and also honest forum, and I think it needs to be. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.